My wife introduced her boyfriend at our 23rd anniversary dinner. What she didn't know was I'd already emptied every account she thought was hers. Welcome to Revenge Galore. If you crave gripping stories where public humiliation meets private preparation and betrayal gets its ultimate comeuppance, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button for your daily dose of strategic justice served ice cold. My name is Jonathan Whitmore and I'm 52 years old. For 23 years, I've been the devoted husband who put his family first, the reliable provider who built a successful financial planning practice while my wife Meredith pursued her passions. Art classes, yoga retreats, charity galas, and apparently personal trainers named Blake. The Carlisle Country Club's main dining room was exactly as I'd expected. Crystal chandeliers reflecting off polished silverware, the soft murmur of Augusta's elite enjoying their Saturday evening rituals. Meredith had insisted we celebrate our 23rd anniversary here, surrounded by our closest friends. She'd been particularly excited about tonight, almost giddy in a way I hadn't seen in years. I should have known something was wrong. We were seated at our usual table, the Pemberton family on one side, the Ashfords on the other, all of us couples who'd grown up together in Augusta's financial district social circle. The conversation flowed easily around topics we'd discussed 1,000 times. Golf handicaps, vacation properties, children's college achievements, business ventures. Meredith seemed unusually animated, checking her phone frequently and glancing toward the entrance. She dressed carefully tonight, the black dress I'd bought her for Christmas, the diamond earrings from our 15th anniversary, her grandmother's pearl necklace. She looked beautiful, radiant even. I thought she was finally happy again. I was wrong about the reason. Jonathan has been such a wonderful provider, Meredith was saying to Sandra Ashford, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was building up to something important. 23 years of putting our family first, never complaining when I needed time to find myself. The other couples nodded approvingly. In our social circle, devoted husbands were appreciated, even if they were sometimes taken for granted. I'd built my reputation as the steady one, the financial advisor who helped everyone navigate market volatility and plan for comfortable retirements. Reliable Jonathan Whitmore, always there when you needed him. Speaking of finding yourself, Meredith continued, her eyes bright with an excitement I finally recognized as anticipation, I have an announcement to make. She stood up, her champagne glass still half full, and looked around the table at our friends. Then she turned toward the dining room entrance and I followed her gaze. A man was walking toward our table, tall, athletic, probably in his early 30s with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having worried about mortgage payments or college tuition. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his suit expensive but fashionable rather than conservative. He moved through the dining room like he owned it, drawing appreciative glances from women at other tables. Everyone, Meredith said, her voice carrying across our section of the dining room, I'd like you to meet Blake Garrison. He's the reason I've been so happy lately. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes earthquakes. Our friends' faces registered confusion, then understanding, then shock. Sandra Ashford's hand went to her throat. Robert Pemberton actually dropped his fork. Blake arrived at our table with a smile that was equal parts charming and predatory. He placed his hand on the back of Meredith's chair, a gesture of possession that wasn't lost on anyone present. Blake is let's just call him my happiness, Meredith continued, her voice gaining strength from whatever reaction she was seeing in my face. We've been together for 8 months now, and I've finally realized what I've been missing all these years. She looked directly at me then, and I saw something in her expression that took my breath away. Not guilt or regret, but triumph. She was enjoying this. The public nature of the announcement, the shock on our friends' faces, the anticipation of my humiliation. I know this is unexpected, she continued, but Jonathan and I have grown apart over the years. We want different things. I want to feel alive again, and Blake makes me feel like the woman I used to be. 8 months. While I'd been working 12-hour days to fund her lifestyle, she'd been building a relationship with a man barely older than our son David. While I'd been planning our anniversary celebration, she'd been planning this public execution of our marriage. The dining room had gone quiet around us. Other patrons were pretending not to stare while obviously hanging on every word. Our waiter had stopped approaching, sensing the tension at our table. Meredith, Robert Pemberton said carefully, perhaps this conversation should be private? No, she interrupted, her hand finding Blake's arm. I'm tired of living a lie. I'm tired of pretending that being married to a financial advisor is fulfilling. Blake has shown me what passion looks like. Blake smiled at this, clearly enjoying his role in the drama. Meredith deserves to be happy, he said, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from youth and ignorance. Life's too short to settle for comfortable. All eyes turned to me then, waiting for the explosion, the shouting, the dramatic exit everyone expected. In their experience, devoted husbands confronted with public betrayal either collapsed or erupted. They were waiting to see which version of Jonathan Whitmore would emerge. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a cream-colored envelope, the same shade as our wedding invitations 23 years ago. I placed it gently on the table in front of Meredith, then took a sip of my wine. "What's this?" Meredith asked, her triumphant expression faltering slightly. "Your anniversary gift," I said quietly. "Something I've been working on for quite some time." The confusion on her face was genuine. This wasn't the reaction she'd expected or planned for. Blake's confident smile wavered as he tried to read the room. "I think we should discuss this privately," Meredith said, her voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "No," I replied, borrowing her words. "I'm tired of keeping secrets." I stood up, straightened my tie, and addressed our stunned friends. "I apologize for the disruption to your evening. Meredith and Blake, I'm sure you'll want to review those documents carefully. I've taken the liberty of settling our bill." Then I walked out of the Carlisle Country Club with my head held high, feeling 23 years of accumulated disappointment finally crystallizing into something that felt remarkably like freedom. Behind me, I could hear Meredith's voice rising in panic as she tore open the envelope, but I didn't turn around. The real show was just beginning and I had work to do. The documents in that envelope contained the beginning of Meredith's education about the financial realities of our marriage, realities she'd never bothered to understand because she'd assumed I'd always be there to handle them. What she was discovering as I drove home was that I'd been preparing for this moment far longer than she'd been planning her grand betrayal. The signs had been there for months, maybe longer. Meredith's sudden interest in fitness, her new wardrobe, the way she'd started talking about living authentically, and following your heart. The mysterious phone calls that ended when I entered the room, the girls' trips that lasted longer than planned, the emotional distance that had grown between us despite my attempts to bridge it. I tried to rationalize it at first. Midlife crisis, empty nest syndrome now that our children were grown, all the explanations that married couples use when they don't want to face uncomfortable truths. But I hadn't survived 25 years in financial planning by ignoring warning signs. 3 months ago, I'd hired Richmond Investigations, a discreet firm that specialized in marital surveillance. The photos they'd provided were clear and damning. Meredith and Blake at restaurants I couldn't afford on my salary, weekend trips to Charleston and Savannah, shopping expeditions where Blake's credit card covered expenses that never appeared on our joint statements. More importantly, the investigation had revealed Blake's background. Blake Garrison, 32 years old, employed as a personal trainer at an upscale fitness studio, but his real income came from a series of relationships with wealthy older women. Meredith wasn't his first married client to fall for his particular brand of charm, and she wouldn't be his last. The financial records were the most interesting part. Blake had expensive tastes: luxury car lease, high-end apartment in Augusta's trendy district, designer clothing, and jewelry for his various romantic interests. His personal trainer salary barely covered his gym membership, let alone his lifestyle. He was living off women like Meredith, and Meredith was living off me. But what Blake and Meredith didn't understand was the structure of our financial life. Meredith had always been happy to let me handle the boring aspects of money management. She had credit cards, a checking account for household expenses, and access to what she thought was our joint savings account. What she didn't know was that the bulk of our assets were held in structures she'd never bothered to learn about. My financial planning practice was a limited liability company with complex ownership structures. Our investment accounts were held in trusts that protected them from divorce proceedings. The house was owned by a family trust that I controlled. Even our cars were leased through business entities that she couldn't access. 23 years of marriage to a financial planner, and Meredith had never asked how our money was actually organized. She'd been content to spend what I provided without understanding where it came from or how it was protected. That was about to change. I drove home through Augusta's historic district, past the antebellum homes and tree-lined streets that had attracted us to the area 25 years ago. Our house was dark. Meredith was obviously planning to stay out late celebrating her liberation. I parked in the garage and walked through the rooms where we'd raised our children, hosted dinner parties, and built what I'd thought was a life together. In my study, I opened the safe and pulled out the files I'd been preparing for the past 3 months. Legal documents, financial statements, investigation reports, and correspondence with attorneys in 3 states. Everything organized with the same attention to detail I brought to my client's retirement planning. My phone started ringing at 10:47 p.m. Meredith's name on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail. The second call came at 11:15. The third at 11:33. By midnight, she'd called 6 times without leaving a message. Finally, at 12:22 a.m., she sent a text. "We need to talk. This is insane. Come back to the club." I turned off my phone and went to bed. The next morning, I was drinking coffee on our back deck when I heard Meredith's car in the driveway. The front door slammed with enough force to rattle the windows, followed by the rapid clicking of her heels across the hardwood floors. "Jonathan." Her voice echoed through the house, high-pitched and desperate. "Where are you?" I stayed on the deck, watching cardinals at the bird feeder Meredith had bought 3 years ago during her brief gardening phase. She found me there 5 minutes later, still wearing her dress from the night before, her makeup smeared and her carefully styled hair disheveled. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, waving the papers from the envelope. "Divorce papers?" I said. "Freezes? Jonathan, have you lost your mind?" I looked up from my coffee. "Good morning, Meredith. How was your evening? Don't you dare act calm about this. You can't just file for divorce without talking to me." "Actually, I can. And I did. The papers were filed Friday afternoon. You were served last night." Her face went pale. "Friday? You filed before our anniversary dinner? Before you introduced Blake to our friends?" "Yes. Though I have to say the timing worked out perfectly." Meredith sank into the chair across from me, the papers scattered across the wrought iron table. "You knew? About Blake? For 3 months. I know about the trips to Charleston, the jewelry he bought you with money from our joint account, the apartment you've been helping him afford. I know about his other relationships and his interesting approach to funding his lifestyle." She stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. "You've been planning this very carefully. You'd be surprised how much a financial planner can accomplish when he puts his mind to it." Meredith's phone started buzzing on the table. Blake's name appeared on the screen. She looked at it but didn't answer. "He's been calling all night," she said quietly. "Ever since we read the papers." "I imagine he has. The asset freeze affects the joint accounts he's been accessing through your credit cards. The car lease that runs through my business? Canceled as of this morning. The apartment deposit you made last month? The banks flagged it as a fraudulent transaction during divorce proceedings." Her phone buzzed again. Blake insistent. "Answer it," I suggested. I'd love to hear his thoughts on the situation. Meredith hesitated, then picked up the phone. "Blake?" Even from across the table I could hear his voice, loud and agitated. Meredith's face crumpled as she listened. "Blake, slow down. I don't understand. What do you mean the card was declined?" More shouting from the phone. Meredith pulled it away from her ear, staring at it as if it had bitten her. He's blaming me," she said numbly. "He says I told him the money situation was secure. He says if I can't keep my promises, then maybe this relationship isn't what he thought it was." I nodded sympathetically. 8 months of romance and it only took 12 hours for him to show his true colors. That's actually faster than I expected. "Jonathan, please. We can work this out. I made a mistake." "No." I stood up, gathering my coffee and the morning paper. "You made a choice. A very public choice. And choices have consequences." I paused at the deck door. "The house will need to be sold as part of the divorce proceedings. You have 60 days to find other living arrangements. My attorney will be in touch about the custody schedule for holidays with the children." "Custody schedule?" "Jonathan, they're adults. David and Catherine will need to decide which parent they want to spend holidays with, assuming they want to maintain relationships with both of us. Last night's performance probably didn't help your position in that negotiation." I went inside, leaving Meredith on the deck with her phone and her papers in her rapidly shrinking world. The next week passed in a carefully orchestrated sequence of legal and financial maneuvers that I'd been planning for months. Asset protection in divorce isn't about hiding money, it's about understanding how money flows and ensuring that the contributing partner isn't left destitute by the partner who never bothered to learn how their lifestyle was funded. My attorney, Sterling Blackwell, had been preparing for this case since I'd first consulted him in January. Sterling specialized in high-asset divorces, and he'd seen dozens of cases like mine. Successful professionals married to spouses who'd never understood or appreciated the work required to maintain their lifestyle. "The prenuptial agreement is solid," Sterling assured me during our Monday morning meeting. "Infidelity clauses are still enforceable in Georgia, especially with the evidence your investigator gathered. She'll be entitled to spousal support, but nothing like what she's been accustomed to spending. The investigation had revealed the full scope of Meredith's financial irresponsibility. In addition to funding Blake's lifestyle, she'd been making substantial purchases that she'd hidden from me: art pieces, jewelry, designer clothing, spa treatments. The credit cards I'd thought were for household expenses had been funding a fantasy life that bore no relation to our actual income. What about the business? I asked. Protected. The LLC structure keeps your practice separate from marital assets. She might be entitled to some value from the years you built it during marriage, but she can't touch the ongoing operation or client relationships. Sterling slid a document across his desk. We need to discuss the house, though. She's refusing to move out. I wasn't surprised. The house was the symbol of everything Meredith thought she was entitled to: the 6-bedroom colonial in Augusta's historic district, the pool and tennis court, the gardens she'd had professionally designed but never maintained herself. It was also the most visible sign of our social status, and she knew that losing it would signal her reduced circumstances to everyone who mattered in our social circle. She can stay until the sale closes, I said. But she'll need to cover the utilities and maintenance herself. The business accounts that were funding household expenses are now frozen pending divorce proceedings. That afternoon, I moved my essential belongings to a furnished apartment downtown, 3 blocks from my office. It was temporary, but it was also symbolic. I was starting over, and this time I was doing it on my own terms. The apartment was smaller than our house but perfectly adequate for my needs. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room with built-in bookshelves that reminded me of my college days. It felt more like home than the house had in years. My phone rang constantly the first few days: Meredith calling to negotiate, friends calling to get the real story, colleagues expressing concern about my difficult situation. I answered only the essential calls and kept my responses brief and professional. The most important call came on Thursday evening. My daughter Catherine, calling from San Francisco where she worked as a marketing director for a tech company. Dad, what the hell happened at the country club? Mom's telling everyone you had some kind of breakdown. Your mother introduced her boyfriend to our friends at our anniversary dinner. I served her with divorce papers. Now she's discovering what our financial situation actually looks like. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Boyfriend? Dad, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I didn't want you and David to worry. But yes, she's been having an affair for several months. Mom said you froze all the bank accounts and threw her out of the house. I protected the assets that weren't legally hers and I moved out myself. She's welcome to stay in the house until it sells, but she'll need to cover the expenses. Another pause. Dad, David and I talked. We want you to know that we're not choosing sides, but what Mom did was horrible. The public humiliation, the way she's trying to make you look like the bad guy, it's not okay. Hearing my daughter's support meant more than I'd expected. I appreciate that, sweetheart. But you don't need to take sides. This is between your mother and me. Actually, Dad, it's not just between you two anymore. She made it public. She involved all your friends, and now she's calling us trying to get us to pressure you to be reasonable. David told her he wasn't getting involved in her drama. Catherine paused. There's something else. Mom asked if David or I could help her with some expenses. She said you'd cut off her access to money and she couldn't even buy groceries. I wasn't surprised. The joint accounts that Meredith had access to contained enough money for reasonable living expenses, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to or to continue funding Blake's needs. Your mother has access to several $1,000s for legitimate expenses, I said. She just can't access the investment accounts or business assets that were never hers to begin with. Dad? I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. I know this can't be easy. After we hung up, I sat in my small living room thinking about the different ways people respond to crisis. Some collapse, some explode, some find strength they didn't know they had. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just maintaining. The following week brought news that confirmed my assessment of Blake's character. According to my investigator, he'd moved out of his expensive apartment and was staying with another client, a recently divorced woman in her 50s who'd hired him as a personal trainer and was apparently providing the same additional services that Meredith had been offering. Meredith's calls became more frequent and more desperate. She wanted to meet, to talk, to work things out like civilized adults. She promised to end things with Blake, to go to counseling, to be the wife I deserved. I didn't return her calls. Instead, I focused on the practical aspects of rebuilding my life. My financial planning practice was actually thriving. Several new clients had approached me after hearing about my situation. apparently impressed by my decisive handling of my personal crisis. There's something about a financial advisor who practices what he preaches that inspires confidence. I also started dating, something I hadn't thought about in 23 years. Margaret Ashton, a widow who'd been a client for several years, mentioned that she had a friend, a divorced attorney named Caroline Everett who specialized in estate planning. We met for coffee, then dinner, then a weekend trip to Charleston. Caroline was everything Meredith wasn't: self-sufficient, intellectually curious, genuinely interested in my work and opinions. She'd built her own successful practice, raised 2 children as a single mother after her husband's death, and approached relationships with the kind of practical wisdom that comes from having survived real hardship. "You're remarkably calm for someone going through a contentious divorce," she observed over dinner at a small restaurant in Charleston's historic district. "I've had months to prepare," I said. "And I learned a long time ago that the best revenge is living well." "Is that what this is? Revenge?" I considered the question carefully. Justice maybe. Or just natural consequences. Meredith made choices, and now she's learning what those choices cost. Caroline nodded. "I see a lot of divorces in my practice. The ones that go smoothly are usually the ones where both parties understand what they actually contributed to the marriage. The messy ones are where one person was living in a fantasy about their financial situation. Meredith never wanted to understand our finances. She just wanted to spend without worrying about where the money came from. And now she's learning where it really came from." The divorce proceedings moved efficiently through the court system. Sterling had prepared our case meticulously, and Meredith's attorney, a family lawyer she'd found through a friend, was clearly outmatched by the complexity of the financial structures involved. The preliminary hearings went exactly as Sterling had predicted. The court upheld the prenuptial agreement, recognized the infidelity clause, and awarded me primary control of the business assets and investment accounts. Meredith would receive spousal support, but at a level that reflected her actual contribution to our financial success rather than her spending habits. The house sold quickly, Augusta's real estate market was strong, and our property was well located and well maintained. After paying off the mortgage and dividing the proceeds according to the prenuptial agreement, Meredith received enough money to buy a small condo and maintain a modest lifestyle. It was more than fair, but it was far less than she'd expected. The final hearing was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday in October, exactly 6 months after Meredith's anniversary announcement. She arrived at the courthouse looking older and more subdued than I'd seen her in years. Blake was nowhere to be seen. According to my investigator, he'd moved to Atlanta with his new benefactor and hadn't spoken to Meredith in over a month. The judge reviewed our settlement agreement efficiently. Property division, spousal support, retirement account splits, all the financial details that would define our separate futures. Meredith signed the papers without comment, her face expressionless. As we left the courthouse, she approached me in the parking lot. "Jonathan, I want you to know that I'm sorry. Not just about Blake, but about taking you for granted all those years." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since that anniversary dinner. She was still attractive, still the woman I'd fallen in love with 23 years ago. But something fundamental had changed, and it wasn't just the circumstances. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Meredith." I thought I was looking for excitement, for passion. I thought our marriage was boring. It was comfortable. "There's a difference." She nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I know that now. I know what I lost." I felt sympathy for her, genuinely. But sympathy isn't the same as reconciliation, and understanding isn't the same as forgiveness. "Take care of yourself," I said and walked away. 1 year later, I was living in a house I'd bought in Augusta's downtown district, a restored Victorian that Caroline had helped me choose. It was smaller than the house I'd shared with Meredith, but it was mine entirely, furnished with pieces I'd selected myself rather than items chosen by a decorator. My financial planning practice had grown substantially. Word had spread through Augusta's business community about my handling of my divorce, and several high-net-worth individuals had approached me about managing their affairs. There's something about a financial advisor who successfully protected his own assets that inspires confidence in potential clients. Caroline and I had developed a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility. We maintained separate residences and separate finances, but we'd found a partnership that neither of us had thought possible at our age. She understood the demands of professional life, and I appreciated her independence and intellectual curiosity. Most importantly, my relationships with David and Catherine had actually strengthened after the divorce. They'd seen how I'd handled a difficult situation with dignity and strategic thinking, and they'd lost respect for their mother's impulsive decisions and poor judgment. "I'm proud of how you handled everything," David told me during a visit home from graduate school. "You could have made it ugly, but you kept it professional." "Your mother made her choices," I said. "I just made sure those choices had appropriate consequences." Catherine nodded. "I think Mom thought you'd always be there to clean up her mistakes. She never realized that you were the one keeping everything together." As for Meredith, I heard occasional updates through mutual friends. She'd moved to a small condo across town and was working part-time at an art gallery, her first job in over 20 years. Blake had lasted exactly as long as it took him to find a more financially stable replacement, and she was dating occasionally but hadn't found anyone willing to support the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. The most telling detail came from Sandra Ashford, who'd seen Meredith at a grocery store clipping coupons and buying generic brands. "She looked diminished," Sandra told Caroline during a charity event. "Like she'd finally realized what she'd given up." I didn't take satisfaction in Meredith's reduced circumstances, but I didn't feel guilt about them either. She'd made her choices with full knowledge of the consequences, and now she was living with the results. The real satisfaction came from building something new and better than what I'd lost. The marriage I'd thought was solid had been built on unequal foundations, my work and sacrifice supporting her dreams and desires. The relationship I'd built with Caroline was based on mutual contribution and respect. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies, it's building a better life than the one they tried to take from you. On a warm evening in May, almost exactly 2 years after that anniversary dinner at the Carlisle Country Club, Caroline and I were having dinner at a small restaurant downtown when I noticed familiar faces at a corner table. Meredith and a man I didn't recognize, both dressed modestly, sharing an appetizer and splitting a bottle of house wine. She looked over and saw me, gave a small wave that was neither friendly nor hostile. Just acknowledgement between two people who'd once shared a life and now shared only history. Caroline followed my gaze. "Is that your ex-wife?" "That's Meredith. She looks ordinary." That was exactly right. Meredith looked ordinary, not glamorous, not exciting, not like someone worth destroying a marriage for. Just a middle-aged woman on a modest date, making the best of circumstances that were entirely of her own making. "How do you feel seeing her like that?" Caroline asked. I thought about it carefully. Grateful. Grateful? That I learned who she really was before it was too late to build something better. Caroline smiled and raised her wine glass. "To second chances. To strategic planning," I replied, and we both laughed. Later that night, as I was reading in my study, I reflected on the journey from that anniversary dinner to this moment. Meredith had tried to humiliate me publicly, to force me into the role of the betrayed husband who would either collapse or explode. Instead, I'd used her betrayal as an opportunity to reveal my own strength and competence. The financial structures I'd built over 23 years had protected me exactly as they were designed to do. The legal preparations I'd made had ensured that justice was served through proper channels rather than emotional chaos. Most importantly, the strategic thinking that had made me successful in business had served me well in the most personal crisis of my life. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Dad, Catherine and I are planning to visit next month. Caroline's invited too, right? We want to get to know her better." I smiled and typed back, "Of course. Looking forward to it." Outside, Augusta was settling into another warm spring evening. Somewhere across town, Meredith was probably discovering that her modest new life was the natural consequence of the choices she'd made 2 years ago. Somewhere in Atlanta, Blake was probably charming another wealthy woman who thought she was buying excitement but was really just funding his lifestyle. And here, in the house I'd chosen for myself, with a woman who appreciated my strength rather than taking it for granted, I was building something that was entirely my own. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be the victim of someone else's poor decisions. Sometimes the most powerful response to public humiliation is quiet dignity and strategic action. Meredith had tried to write the story of our marriage's end, casting herself as the liberated woman and me as the boring husband left behind. Instead, she'd given me the opportunity to write a better story, one where careful planning and moral integrity triumph over impulse and selfishness. The anniversary gift I'd given her that night wasn't just divorce papers. It was the chance for both of us to discover who we really were when the comfortable illusions were stripped away. I discovered that I was stronger and more capable than I'd known. She discovered that excitement and passion are poor substitutes for loyalty and partnership. In the end, we'd both learned exactly what our 23 years of marriage had been worth. What would you do if your spouse publicly humiliated you at a major family event? How do you balance protecting yourself financially while maintaining your dignity in a crisis? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of strategic preparation triumphing over selfish betrayal, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Revenge Galore for more stories where quiet intelligence defeats public humiliation. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest tales of justice served with dignity.